Unfortunately, due to time, we can't ask any questions. I mean, it's kind of frustrating because I have questions. But anyway, I have to introduce the next panel, which is titled Roots and Branches, the Arts Scholars Panel, moderated by Adrienne Childs. And Adrienne Childs is an independent scholar, an art historian, and a curator. She is an associate of the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Her interests are in the relationship between race and representation in European and American art. She has written on diverse topics such as Henry Ossawa Tanner in North Africa, Black Bodies in Meissen Porcelain, and The Prince of David C. Driscoll and Margot Humphrey. She recently contributed the essay Activism and the Shaping of Black Identities, 1964 to 1988, to The Image of the Black in Western Art, volume number 5. You all know that wonderful series from Harvard University Press. She is co-editor of Blacks in European Art of the Long 19th Century, published by Ashgate. I contributed to that volume. It's great collaborating with Adrienne. She is also co-curating The Black Figure in the European Imaginary to open at Rollins College in 2017. Adrienne has lectured widely on her next book project, which is an exploration of blacks in European decorative arts entitled Ornamental Blackness, the Black Body in European Decorative Arts. So, Adrienne.
Thank you, James. A thorough job with my bio, and I am going to shortchange all the rest of the people coming behind me, unfortunately, because we are rushing to get through the next panel. So I'm going to give abbreviated bios of our wonderful panelists who are really very accomplished. Now, we know that the title of this next panel is Roots and Branches, Art Scholars Panel. And that, to me, I guess we're going to look at some of the antecedents, some of how deep the roots of these of the Black arts movement goes in terms of, more traditional visual arts, painting, sculpture, the visual arts. And we have three art historians here who are digging deep into that material. I'm going to give you the bios first, and then we're going to go right in, because I really want to have some discussion afterwards. First, we're going to hear from Nicholas Miller, who is currently serving as a professional lecturer in George Washington University's Department of Art and Art History. He is additionally completing his dissertation, wonderful, at Northwestern University. And his project is called Primitivist Encounters, African American Painting, Diasporic Objects, and the Making of Modern Art, 1927 to 77. And in it, he advocates for reconceptualizing modernist primitivism. And he's looking at it as a more productive way that Black artists explored the intertwined legacies of modernity and the African diaspora and the colonialism. So that's really a fresh way of looking at this material. He has previously served as a pre-doctoral fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And today he's going to talk to us about style. And the title of the piece is On Bandoliers and Revolutionary Blackness, Wives of Shango and Radical Chic. Then we're going to hear from Tobias Wolford, who received his Ph.D. from UCLA, and he is now an assistant professor at Santa Clara University, not to be confused with UC Santa Clara. This year he holds a prestigious Terra Foundation postdoc at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And his book project that we're looking forward to is going to be examining multiple roles of Africa in post-1950s African American art. And then finally, we're going to hear from Rueko Hockley, and she is an assistant curator at of contemporary art at the Brooklyn Museum, which is very impressive. She joined the museum there in 2012 and has since worked on exhibitions, and I'll just name a few: Latoya Ruby Fraser, A Haunted Capital. She worked on the Kehinde Wiley, A New Republic, and the Kara Walker, African Boy Attendant Curio, Bananas. She serves on the board of Art Matters as well as advisory board of Recess. Oh, I don't know this organization. You have to tell me how to pronounce it. She received her BA from Columbia University and is now a PhD candidate in art history, theory, and criticism at the University of California at San Diego. And she will talk about, her paper is called We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 1965 to 1985. So I'm very happy to introduce you to Nicholas Miller.
Perfect, thank you. I think we can still say good afternoon. Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank the conference organizers, the planners, Professor Harvey, she's running around, for inviting me. We had a great experience together at the American Art Museum, and I'm thankful for our friendship and kind of academic relationship through that. Just to kind of set up the paper a little bit, I started kind of my writing process about Jeff Donaldson around the same time the Ferguson Rebellion took place. I had just finished reading the Kerner Commission, which we learned about yesterday, and found myself always in this process of kind of being stunted because I was constantly shuttling back and forth between these kind of two divergent temporal schemes. Like, I was writing about Jeff Donaldson, his relationship to the Chicago riot, his painting a la Shango, and I'd find my words kind of slipping into the circumstances of what's going on in Ferguson and the Black Lives Matter, and it just kind of was this kind of shifting constellation of temporalities that I was experiencing. I think going back to something like the Kerner Commission is really important because, in that, we talked about it yesterday as kind of announcing the fact that riots and rebellions, their origin is not just in police brutality, but in the structural antagonisms or the structural racism that really excludes Black populations in the U.S. from kind of the dominant cultural sphere. And I think that was the same in the 1960s as we're experiencing today, and it's an important message that we should encounter. And so this paper is kind of a thought experiment, thinking about the ways that not only the discourses of Black protest are kind of reminiscent of one another, but that their iconographies are also similar. And so it's kind of, it's a think piece. It's an early attempt to kind of reckon with these relationships. Writing for a 1970 issue of the periodical Black World, Jeff Donaldson would recount the founding of one of the Black arts movement's most central artistic collectives, AfriCobra. In his essay, 10 in Search of a Nation, Donaldson attempts to not only lay out the collective's aesthetic program, but also account for the evolution of Black political thought from the early 1960s belief in civil disobedience, emblematized by the practices of Martin Luther King Jr., to the more militant Black nationalist discourse of Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and the Black Panther Party in general. In Donaldson's recounting, at the center of the transition from nonviolence to militancy was anti-Black violence, the assassinations of King, Malcolm, Lumumba, the riots in Watts, Detroit, Chicago, and Harlem, and the confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. For Donaldson, ideologies that once provided a sense of optimism and integration now transformed into active revolutionary resistance as nonviolence no longer seemed like a feasible option to counter racism, police brutality, and white hegemony. Along with the many reproductions of AfriCobra artwork accompanying the article, two directly depicted figures ready to engage in revolutionary resistance through the brandishing of arms, Donaldson's Wives of Shango and J. Jarrell's Revolutionary Suit. In both works, Donaldson and Jarrell display heavily armed and defiantly posed Black female bodies, reminiscent of the radical representations advanced by the Black Panther Party, images of what Kara Keeling has termed Blacks with guns. As Donaldson's title indicates, the women represented in the painting are the Yoruba Orishas, specifically the Wives of Shango, Oya, Oshun, and Oba. They stand before the viewer, clothed in their associated colors of red yellow, and white. They are at once, quote, symbolic representations of Yoruba power and strength, end quote, as Tulisa Fleming has noted, but also icons of resistance, as their flaunted rifles and bandoliers make them models for revolutionary action. Similarly, Jarrell's urban guerrilla fashion statement emphasizes the necessity of being armed and prepared for defense should it be necessary in the US public sphere. When worn, it encourages a public performance of militancy in the face of anti-Black kind of public violence. Donaldson and Jarrell's work was part of a broader struggle within the United States to address the relationship between the state, violence, and anti-Black racism. Individuals such as Malcolm X and Carmichael, or the Black Panther Party, took as an a priori principle that the legitimate use of violence was largely consolidated within the powers of the state, a state that could not be trusted to provide protection for the underserved and non-white populations throughout the nation. As Newton argued, with reference to the abuse of force utilized in quelling the riots taking place in urban America, quote, the police are everywhere and use the same tools and have the same purpose, the protection of the ruling circle here in North America, end quote. In order to counteract the privileging of the ruling circle, over the protection of their own communities, the Black Panther Party took up arms, and in so doing confronted the most dominant representations of state power, namely the police, on their own terms, armed not only with weapons, but also a sophisticated understanding of their constitutional rights. They publicly displayed their right to bear weaponry in the public sphere, and they confronted state-sanctioned violence directly. It was precisely images informed by this militant action, such as Wives of Shango, and public performances, the public performances that would accompany Jarrell's suit, that provided a new set of visualizations of the Black body, both male and female. These new forms of representation, such as the Black Panther Party's armed occupation of the Capitol building in Sacramento, challenged stereotypical iterations of the racialized body, and thereby disturbed white audiences' preconceived understandings of race and its public display, while buttressing the ever-increasing pride in Blackness demonstrated by African diaspora communities worldwide, as we also saw yesterday. Donaldson and Jarrell's work is especially pertinent in this context of the new representations and the ways in which armed resistance was visually represented in the Black arts and Black power movements. By incorporating women into the field of Black revolutionary action, Donaldson and Jarrell's work disrupted the male-dominant field of visuality and kind of incorporated women into the kind of the vanguard of this powerful display and feminist display of action. However, the messages of Jarrell's work, the message Jarrell's work attempts to convey has the potential to dissolve into artifice, as one realizes the bandolier only possesses wooden clothespins, not actually shells or bullets. For Donaldson, the kind of style politics, to borrow a phrase from Kobina Mercer, of the represented Orishas are equal parts revolutionary and sartorially seductive, as their mini dresses and bandoliers generate an alluring militant couture. As such, both risk slipping from a message of defense and readiness in the face of anti-Black violence to a spectacularized fashion statement easily co-opted by capitalism, which is precisely what they did. 2 months after a photograph of these two works were published alongside of 10 Men in Search of a Nation, an article in Jet titled Black Revolt Sparks White Fashion Craze proclaimed the bandolier as the, quote, latest fashion accessory to sweep the country, and that it, quote, was selling for $25 to $50 at top fashion boutiques across the country, end quote. The article explicitly mentions the influence of Donaldson's work and Jarrell's work, and the reproductions of both his Wives of Shango and the revolutionary suit as spurring forth this fashion revolution. As an illustration of this new fashion craze, the author included a photograph of Ethel Skull donning the bandolier around her waist. Captured with arms akimbo, a slight tilt of her waist, and knee-high black boots, the famous pop art collector is strategically posed in front of Jasper John's painting, Double Flag, which was then in the Skull's family collection. Her stern expression and militant posture serve as a dramatic contrast to previous artistic portraits of the collector, as if to signify her own transformation in relation to this new emerging Black radical moment. In perhaps its most sexualized iteration, a woman clad only in panties with a bandolier strapped across her chest appears on the cover of Jet's 1972 calendar. In this iteration, Donaldson and Jarrell's aspirational objective and their depiction of the revolutionary black female body is suppressed, as the female body is presented as a more kind of passive object intended for the male or masculine-like gaze. Although Donaldson is quoted in the article as expressing hesitation regarding the transformation of the bandolier from a signifier of armed revolution to closely almost pornographic ornament, he ultimately concludes that, quote, success of the style could mean the wearing of arms would be in fashion, end quote. Ultimately, however, Donaldson's wishful thinking was never fully realized. Rather, the Black Panther Party's appearance, once a provocative challenge to white perceptions of the black body, became a source of almost fetishistic fascination by the white elites, such as Skull. Recounting a Black Panther fundraising event at the house of Broadway composer Leonard Bernstein, journalist Tom Wolfe recounts the appearance of members of the party with little to no discussion of their kind of revolutionary aspirations, describing the party's, the members' clothing as an iteration of the new, quote, radical chic, end quote. He lavishes attention on the men's, quote, tight pants, the tight black turtlenecks, the leather coats, end quote, and the women's, quote, lean and lithe bodies, end quote. He praises their afros for their seeming authenticity, describing them as, quote, real afros, not the ones that have been shaped and trimmed like a topiary hedge and sprayed until they have the sheen like acrylic wall to wall. He concludes by describing this white fascination of the non-white body as an interest in, quote, low-rent primitives, end quote, a category to which he associates Latin American, African American, and Native American identities. In this iteration of primitivism, non-white identities and cultures are not utilized to advance a series of kind of modernist maneuvers in the style of primitivism we kind of think about in relationship to art production. But rather, this iteration of primitivism displays kind of black identity as fully co-opted and commodified, providing a vogue new appearance for the upper Manhattan socialites. Writing in response to the original Jet article, one reader, Daryl Ure of Omaha, Nebraska, cautioned against the celebrated co-optation of revolutionary costume. Stridently, he wrote that encouraging other African American citizens to wear the bandolier was, quote, an attempt of genocide against black people, end quote. He specifically keyed in on the article's reproduction of a photograph of Eddie Bolden and noted, rightly, that Bolden was involved in the revolutionary struggle for black emancipation. Therefore, a major distinction needs to be made when comparing the mock bullets worn around Skull's waist and the real weapons brandished by Bolden. Ure continued stating, quote, this is just like walking into revolution with a water gun in your hand, knowing all the time that the enemy is out to kill you, end quote. And that, quote, the white devils are at their old tricks again, but we must not be taken in by their trickery, end quote. Through the translation of the bandolier, the representation of black women with guns and on the front lines of revolutionary struggle transformed into sartorial and sexualized cliche. Once revolutionary appearances of figures such as Kathleen Cleaver standing at the door of the Black Panthers headquarters and flaunting a rifle became depoliticized, commodified, and co-opted. Similar to the ways Leah Rayford has described the appropriation of radical iconography by blaxploitation films, the bandolier and the revolutionary struggle it is associated with were lampooned and stripped of their political resonances. Now, this was a tentative move I had, so we'll see how it goes over. But most recently, the bandolier attracted national media attention as musician Beyonce and her accompanying dancers donned them or black berets in their performance at Super Bowl 50 in San Francisco. In her restaging of the once radical and subsequently co-opted look, the singer blends sexuality with defiance as she re-envisions the self-fashioning of modern militant black female identity. While her visual appearance depended on the bandolier's previous significations for its radicality, the accessory was also utilized in an ultra-nationalist and spectacularized setting, thereby unsettling its revolutionary potential. Beyonce's evocation of the bandolier was but one visual flash in a constellation that has connected the Black Panther Party and the Black arts movement with the current political discourse surrounding Black Lives Matter, The raised fist serves as kind of another example in this kind of lexicon of form and dissemination of form. These objects help galvanize a movement, incite dissent by both the right and the left. But I'm also leery that they are functioning like proverbial water guns, bold and cautioned against, surrogates for revolutionary action rather than being radical in and of themselves. And I just thought this kind of comparison was striking, partly because of the blurred background and kind of both of them and kind of the disposition of the females. But I think what this raises for me is a set of questions kind of regarding the branches of the roots and branches kind of system. And in the spirit of colloquium, I'll kind of just pose some of those thoughts rather than kind of directly answering them, because I think it's still so fresh that I don't have a perfect response. But how do we come to terms with these objects, their reappearance, and the ambivalence that they might suggest? So, this play between sexuality and kind of a revolutionary kind of identity in the Beyonce performance. To reference kind of Dr. Small's earlier remarks, like how might the political be rethought today? So we're not thinking of the Black Arts Movement only from this kind of romanticized guise, and what symbols might be effective in mobilizing this kind of constellation from the 1960s, that's its structure of feeling. What forms do we need, and how should they function? And then what happens to the visual amidst a movement as kind of decentralized and virtual as the Black Lives Matter kind of movement is? And even calling it a movement, I think we can kind of put pressure on that. It's more of a kind of ethos that's kind of permeating our kind of cultures right now. So with those questions, I mean, I'm sure we can hopefully talk about them later at lunch or another time. My time is up. And thank you very much.